So I'm going to begin by justifying my presence, or the presence of this paper in this conference, at risk of embellishing too much the reasons for it, but I will dwell on this a little. Embellishment is a word or an activity that we most often use in terms of beautification or ornamentation. The OED says that to embellish is to beautify with adventitious adornments. And the call for papers for this conference refers to glorious embossing and the ways in which the art of embellishing books can have beautiful, thought-provoking, and sometimes scandalous results. Embellishment then typically enhances an object and makes it something more beautiful. But the desire of the embellisher to enhance is not always joyful or celebratory or aesthetically motivated. An embellished story or an embellished testimony is one that is exaggerated or even fictitious. In these cases, embellishment is predicated on the embellisher's desire to make a text or a testimony something more than it actually is. Such embellishment is predicated on a lack for which the embellisher is seeking, sometimes quite desperately, to compensate. And it's at this point of lack, rather than beauty, that my paper intersects with the theme of this conference. I'm focusing on embellishments in or additions to books that are all about lack, books of elegies, specifically funeral elegies or elegies of mourning, poems on the death of a person, inherent in which is the impossibility of capturing in poetic language the lost, mourned subject. The books I'm exploring date from the 17th century, a period in which elegy was itself a complex and rich poetic designation. It could apply to poems of erotic desire and pursuit, according to an Ovidian tradition, and Christopher Marlowe and John Donne, probably on the course syllabus, were among the poets who wrote highly eroticized love elegies of this kind. So John Donne's Elegy 19 to his mistress going to bed, imagining her body as my America, my newfound land. That's an elegy in the 17th century. Increasingly, though, that term came to refer, and increasingly over the 17th century, so it's a period of particular change for the poetic designation, it came to refer to these poems we now think of as elegy, poems composed in response to a death of a person. And Donne was pivotal in consolidating this application in his elaborate and ambitious funeral elegy composed on the death of the 15-year-old Elizabeth Drury in December 1610. For those of you who don't know the poem, he imagines Drury's tomb at the same time as he imagines his poem as tomb. Both are inadequate for the task of containing her corporeal and incorporeal form. 'Tis lost to trust a tomb with such a guest, or to confine her in a marble chest, the poem opens. And it goes on to ask, can we keep her then in works of hands or of the wits of men? Can she, who no longer would be she, stoop to be in paper wrapped or dwell in an elegy? These clarion questions about the work of elegy as a poetic mode and form illuminate the desire and the lack that underscore all versions of early modern elegy, from the erotic to the funereal, and the work that it tries and inevitably fails to do. In the words of Kate Lilly, elegy engages persistently with the figuration of desire under the aspect of lack or interdiction and the quest for a sufficiently reparative language. The examples of elegy that I'm dealing with today are all shot through with just such desire and lack, a clamoring need to figure the elusive deceased subject, a failed quest for a language in which to do so, and a turn to paralinguistic additions or embellishments that draw attention to or attempt to compensate for this failure. My focal corpus of elegies, with the pun fully intended, are those written on the death of King Charles I, executed on a scaffold outside Whitehall Palace on 30th of January 1649. So here he is, the body of the king being deprived of its head, in a very famous contemporary engraving of the execution and the crowd that witnessed it. Charles I's execution gave rise to a veritable flood of elegiac writing from those devoted to the royalist cause, and it's widely regarded, this moment, by literary historians as a watershed moment in the history of elegy. In the words of Nigel Smith, the death of the king sucked all elegiac energy into its own subject. And the elegiac outpouring was such that elegy became naturalized as a royalist political and affective mode in the mid-17th century. Elegies on royalist commanders Sir Charles Lucas and Sir George Leal, executed after defeat at Colchester in August 1648, began the elegiac canonization of royalist martyrs, while biblical poems such as Robert Herrick's Rex Tragicus appropriated the sufferings of Christ for those of Charles I and his prominent supporters. Immediately after the execution, Bishop Henry King published a deep groan fetched at the funeral of that incomparable and glorious monarch, Charles I. Vaticanium Votivum, a collection of elegies on Charles and other royalist martyrs, was also published in early March. John Quales's Regale Lectum Miseriae, or A Kingly Bed of Misery, followed very shortly afterwards, and then Monumentum Regale, A Tomb for the Monarch, a collection of elegies and epitaphs on the king, published in June. These and other elegies circulating in manuscript and in broadsides sat alongside the century's most prolific publication, the Icon Basilica, or the King's Book, with this very famous frontispiece and its emblematic representation of the prayerful king. Both the icon and the elegiac output of the period worked to establish a tradition of a kingly martyr and to mourn a royal body, one that also figured in royalist minds, a headless body politic. Elegies for King Charles I sit at the centre of John Emmerson's collection of early modern books at the State Library Victoria, which is the collection on which the three of us speaking today and others, Tricia, in the room, are engaged working on in a linkage project. Lawyer and bibliophile and Civil War aficionado, Emmerson acquired texts not only by and about the executed monarch, but of him in more material ways. Emerson's collecting practices could themselves be seen as enacting a desire to reassemble the lost corpus, even the lost body of the king, shown here in one of his books on trial in late 1648. The collection includes a full run of pamphlets documenting that trial and ending in Charles's speech from the scaffold. There is a manuscript letter written to his sister, Elizabeth of Bohemia, which provides traces, this ghostly trace of the king's own handwriting. There was his travelling library in its original cases, the material instantiation of his educational corpus. And this was one item donated to the Bodleian Library in Oxford, so it hasn't stayed here in Australia. And perhaps most spine-tingling in its material proximity to the deceased king is this tiny volume. It's a New Year's gift book, and it's bound in a fragment of Charles I's silk waistcoat. It's an amazing little object. Collecting is perhaps inherently an elegiac activity, comparable to the poets, or at least adjacent to it, motivated by some of the same questions. Can we keep him then in the works of hands or of the wits of men? But to return to the 17th century and away from Emerson himself, the volumes of elegies on Charles I that he collected grapple persistently with the aspect of lack at the core of elegy as a genre. And in the case of elegies on Charles, the extremity of losing a king, individual, royal, body political, martyr, serves only to heighten the elegiac challenge. Faced with the impossibility of finding a sufficiently reparative language for the loss of a king, these poems and volumes, their publishers and their readers, turn to extra-linguistic strategies, embellishments, in attempts to represent the loss. One of the first volumes published after the king's death was this Regale Lectum Miseriae, and this is not an Emmerson copy, penned by John Quarles, son of the more famous Francis, or more famous at least to some of us. Quarles's An Elegy on that never-to-be-forgotten Charles I is full of instances or insistences on the inexpressibility of the loss. What language can there be remaining in this land except me? And that inexpressibility is intimated typographically in that break of the M dash, although in this example, there's no actual gap in the line. It retains its full iambic pentameter length. Later in the same elegy, however, that is not the case. Could I command all feet, I'd make them go and give the sun that day on which they owe to his defeats. I'm in a desert, and I know not where to guide my steps. That path which seems most fair proves most pernicious to me, and will lend my feet a good beginning, but no end. Oh, great Charles, oh, happy word, but what's the next? So in this example, as you can see, the line itself is broken off with that long M dash, and it does not resume. There's no more of the iambic pentameter line. Most striking in this volume, though, is the printing of some copies in 1649 with the text of the elegy on the recto of each page only, and this black printing on the facing verso, a visual illustration and embellishment that seeks to represent visually the unspeakability of the loss. And these are the pages with the quotations that I've just read from. So this black page continues throughout the elegy. As Lois Potter has reflected, the use of emblematic techniques such as these black pages or red ink in some other books on the king's execution is another way of trying to express the inexpressible. Now, Emerson's copy of the Regale Lectum Miseriae is not, sadly, one of those with the black pages. He acquired a 1660 edition, which is purely textual, apart from an elaborate and emblematic portrait of the king as a frontispiece, simpler than but comparable to the icon basilica. I think there's little doubt that he would have loved to own a copy such as this one if he could have. His other volumes on King Charles do, however, contain a number of embellishments that engage with this persistent problem of the king's lost body and the insufficiency of language to reincorporate it. Monumentum regale, A Tomb for the Monarch, is the volume from which I take my title, because its title designates itself and the elegies and epitaphs on the king which it contains to be a tomb for that incomparable and glorious monarch, King Charles I. But can we trust a tomb with such a guest? Will a king stoop to be in paper wrapped or dwell in an elegy? Henry King's elegy in the volume, A Deep Groan Fetched at the Funeral of the Incomparable and Glorious Monarch, suggests not. To speak our grief at full over thy tomb, great soul, we should be thunderstruck and dumb, he says. The trivial offerings of our bubbling eyes are but fair libels at such obsequies. So they're inadequate, it's libelous in terms of what they can say. The Marquis of Montrose's epitaph in the same volume claims a visceral connection to the king's body. It's described here in the subscript as written with the point of his sword, and the final line of the epitaph claims that it's written with blood and wounds. I'll sing thy obsequies with trumpet sounds and write thy epitaph with blood and wounds. Such writing in blood, however, is of course only metaphoric, and the impossibility of containing the substance of Charles I in words in a tomb of poetry is everywhere felt. The epitaph at the end of the volume begins boldly. Within the sacred vault doth lie the quintessence of his majesty. But further down in the poem, it becomes clear that even the very best words, the elixirs of praise, can only detract from his true qualities. They are faint shadows of him, faint shadows on the line before the capitalized portraiture. And the shadowy nature of the elegy's verbal portraiture is echoed in one reader's handwritten embellishment under the visual portrait of Charles I holding his execution cap at the beginning of the volume. So this is the frontispiece to Monumentum regale. Charles, as I say, execution cap, quite a visceral visual representation of the king. Only some copies, including Emerson's, have this portrait. But in Emerson's copy, one FB has written, "This substance is dissolved, his days are spent. Here's nothing left but this umbratic lineament," shadowy outline. With this contemporaneous handwritten subscription, we have moved from extra-textual strategies employed by authors and printers and books of elegies on the king, such as those black pages, to the embellishments added by their readers and users. And among the volumes on Charles, the elegies and related materials in the Emmerson Collection are several striking examples of readers and users grappling via embellishment with the elusiveness of the lost kingly subject. This copy of Charles's speech from the scaffold, a volume that's arguably elegiac, if not an elegy per se, has pasted into it this image of the king just before his execution. And the images are not quite of the quality I hoped they would have transferred to in my PowerPoint. But anyway, the caption at the top there tells us that the image is a lively representation of the manner how His late Majesty was beheaded upon the scaffold 30 January 1648. That's old style dating, hence the 1648. Part of the same image below, in this kind of cartoon of regicidal events, is a representation of the execution of the king's judges. Now, this insertion of the king's body into the volume in a lively representation comes via cutting and pasting from the loyal martyrology, or brief catalogues and characters of the most eminent persons who suffered for their conscience during the late times of rebellion, either by death, imprisonment, banishment, or sequestration. So this is a volume that was published in 1665, and it's the source text for the image that a user has cut and then pasted into Charles's speech from the scaffold. This is also Emerson's copy. He owns this, although it's not the copy from which the user has cut the image, if you follow me. Such cutting and pasting is a very common form of disassemblage and embellishment, as the work of Adam Smythe and others has shown us. And few volumes were immune from such repurposing. Mary Roper, a late 17th century poet, for example, cut and pasted that very famous frontispiece of Charles I from the Icon Basilica into a manuscript poem on the life of the biblical Joseph, instantiating a typological and political relationship between the two. In the materials on the death of Charles in the Emmerson Collection, cutting and pasting similarly works to mobilize the visual image of the king, reattaching at least the lineaments of the king's body to the text of the speech that he uttered. The loyal martyrology is far more confident than our elegies in its representational efficacy. It describes Charles as the exact pattern of patience, piety, or prudence, without questioning those terms' ability to encapsulate a king. And its description of this visual portrait as a lively representation contrasts with our annotator's melancholic insertion on the frontispiece to Monumentum regale, that the king's substance is dissolved and nothing left but this umbratic lineament. The work of elegy, with its figuration of desire under the aspect of lack, is quite distinct from the work of a declarative martyrology like this one. Engaging persistently in the lack of a language in which to contain the lost subject, the elegiac volumes on the king reach for visual embellishments from the M dash and the blank space to represent breaking off of language and incomplete utterances, to the printed black page, to the portrait of the king holding his execution bonnet. Readers and users too annotate and augment via marginalia and via the cut and paste considering or enacting the possibilities of visual reparation for the lack of the king's body in the volumes that proclaim themselves monuments or tombs for him. Like John Donne's Elizabeth Drury, Charles I eluded those who would have him wrapped in paper, dwelling in an elegy. But these embellishments, these visual gestures and their reinsertion of a visual portraiture of the king's body into the texts of elegy augment their engagement with, even if they do not solve, the problem of royal memorialisation. Thank you.